a very short one. Just what is the pushback on the theories of robots taking jobs? I read a short story recently, very short, called The Three Laws of Humanics, I think that's the title, in which the future is made by robots, and they all have to respect, they all expect humans, who are their slaves, to follow the three laws of humanics, which you should never hurt a robot and so on. And it sounded scary, but it sounded also quite plausible in some respects. It's an interesting piece of science fiction.
So it's Vince Cerf again from Google. A couple of points. The first one is that there was, of course, a focus of attention in your talk on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But I'd like to suggest to you that the problem is more general. It's any kind of software that we rely on that makes decisions or does things that has no human in the loop. So I'm actually more worried about random software that ends up in devices that we rely on than I am with the AI and ML problem. Not to discard the AI problem, but just to say it's worse than you think, because people who make devices, this Internet of Things, just throw software in there that they grabbed off the net because it was free and cheap because of that, and pay no attention to what its condition is, and maybe even go out of business or don't bother maintaining it. If there are bugs, they never get fixed. So I'm a little worried about that, and I hope you are too. The other thing which I found mildly puzzling about this robots taking jobs things, do you suppose that during the Industrial Revolution there were a lot of people who said my jobs went away? Those weren't robots, but they were machines. Do you think that a bottling machine is worse or less, or do you think a robot that does more general kinds of things is worse than a machine that makes glass bottles, for example? We've been doing this sort of thing for a couple of hundred years, automating processes. That also includes agriculture. The population in the United States that used to do agriculture was probably in excess of 45 to 50% of the country or more in 1890 and 1910, and now, of course, it's on the order of 2 or 3%. Thanks in large part to massive agribusiness and a lot of automation. So I feel like robots are taking heat for things that they don't deserve, and pardon me for anthropomorphizing the question.
So as thank you for that. I'm only focusing more on AI and machine learning because that's what the meeting is about, but typically in my side of campus, those things, and people pay attention to different things depending on what they're thinking about at the time, rather than thinking of them as really discrete and well differentiated. And that point is really well taken. There's more work on exactly how race and gender bias get built into these very inane and very black boxed bits of whether or not you get a loan, what your credit score is. We're familiar with more work on that than on this more open-ended things where you couldn't necessarily tell right away or ahead of time what might be going to happen later. So that's, there's perhaps a difference there. The robots taking jobs thing is something that the idea that is actually not typically phrased as anything to do with robots. It's more often phrased as whether or not automation is taking which jobs and which bits of jobs. And as you know better than I, people, or at least as well as I, people really vary on what they think about that. Some people think it's going to get rid of all the lower paid jobs, and then we have this huge problem of a massive underclass. Some people think it's not going to get rid of jobs at all because you'll always have to tend and take care of the machines, and that was one of the big lessons from the Industrial Revolution and the Luddites. Some people think that it's a fiction and a fantasy that the more elite jobs are the ones that are going to stick around, and that actually those are going to go too, or that they already have gone, and that's why we have so few ultra-rich people now. Then we have this relatively thin layer of global elites, like all of us in this room, and then we have increasing inequality over time. So some people are reading into the pattern of inequality things that are specific to the technologies at the moment, but in some sense no different than Dust Bowl, no depression, no difference in Industrial Revolution, in the sense that big changes in work, big changes in capital, big changes in value systems, big changes in demographics, big changes in kinship, radically affect the way society is organized, and then whether or not and for how long inequality grows or shrinks. Just joining the call to pay more attention to what's happened historically, but I do think there are specificities, but a lot of different predictions. Tending automated bits of one's job, I feel like we're not giving enough attention at the moment to how excited the everyday person is in fantasizing about which bits of their life they might automate. So I think, you take your typical, like me, working mother, the things I would automate if I could. You have no idea, sleep being the first of it. So, that sort of idea, and that idea that, from the most high executive function parts to the most grunt work bits of our jobs, I do think that there's a lot of creativity, innovation, and excitement about ways we might innovate, and all kinds of startups and energy around ways that we might make childcare partially automated. We might make elder care at least more organized and more joined up, even if it's still really important that humans actually talk to each other, and things like that. So I think, but part of what I really did want to say too, was that we got by before on a productive economy, of which those things, some of the things we think are least likely to be automated, were reproductive or informal, and that's going to probably have to change. Sorry, I'll make my answers shorter.
I think we can take maybe 5 more minutes, so up to you whether.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. While we're on this slide on the future of humanity with a quote from your teenage daughter and a reference to science fiction TV series, I'm reminded of the series Humans, where there's a quote from a teenage daughter in that series. And at one point she says, "What's the point of me doing my homework if anything I do, a computer can do better than I do?" Yeah. And so I'm less of an optimist about the future. If almost every cognitive task a human can do can be done better by a computer, then how are we going to find, our new place in the world in terms of happiness, sense of purpose, everything that we get out of our jobs, et cetera, and the values that we have. And I feel like a lot of the disruption that's now being felt about people losing jobs and immigration and so on could be turned against this automation. So do you have any views on this? I'm sort of a little bit darker than Vince's, I think, vision of the future, maybe.
Thank you. I think what I hear the youth, the kind of teenagers talking about a lot right now is, were you an idiot if you spent loads of time learning to code or not, because you don't actually have to anymore? And so was that yesterday's news, and it was your aspirational parents who made you do it? And so definitely that conversation is all around with the youth. I do think this idea that certain things will take your jobs. They're not, the population is huge. They're not wrong to be worried about having no jobs, and not wrong to be worried about coming out of college not ready to step into jobs. They're also not wrong to be worried about being sorted from the get-go and discriminated against or made less likely to succeed on all kinds of parameters from the get-go. So all of those aspects really, really need addressing, and only some of them are to do with the automation piece, I think.
First of all, thank you. I really, really enjoyed your comments. I wanted to bring you back to this point that you made about human beings' capacity to hybridize and adapt to work with whatever tools we have around us we come to view as extensions of our agency. And I was wondering if there's anything that we can understand from a historical or a social science point of view about how we can facilitate or make sure that this is done as equitably as possible, or encourage this in society, so that we can help people see this as a set of tools that they hybridize with and that they collaborate in achieving greater things, as opposed to feeling that this is an other.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's very segmented. So there are there's a lot of great work in assistive technology, as you know, and augmentative and assistive technology that I think really is about leveling the playing field in really meaningful ways. And I think some of the programs that are personalized for learning disabilities and things, I sort of worry more about I think it was a heinous criterion in the first place. Meritocracy was a very, very problematic concept. But what's going to replace that? How are we going to make trajectories through people's lives if we're not saying, you are the ones that are going to these few universities? The sooner we get out of that era, the better. But what's going to come in its place? And the one good thing about it was that it was a kind of idea that there was some meaningful notion of worth there. The sort of innate intelligence bit is probably dreadful in the older model, but the idea that if you worked really hard, you could do really well, and that would bring you ahead of the pack, and then you would get into these things, and then it would sort of ramify the Matthew effect, the Matilda effect, and you would do better and better. How are we going to combine the ideas of competition and equality without that notion of meritocracy, which has been going to a worse and worse place in terms of separating haves and have-nots, privatized and public childhoods, and so on over time. So I really am very, very interested in new kinds of vocational models, way more but giving them high status like the Swiss do, for example, not going back into one being working class and one being elite. So that's really, really interesting to me, that kind of intervention. But sorry about that.
I wanted to come back to this line about robots replacing jobs. And two quick comments. One, there's a new National Academy study report coming out in February called Automation and the Workforce, which Eric Brynjolfsson from MIT and I co-chaired that study, so it's coming out. I hope you'll all read it when it does. But this second comment comes back to Vince Cerf's question about, well, is there really anything different here? And it seems to me that one of the really big differences is between hardware robots and software agents, let's say, right? Because if you look back at the Industrial Revolution, for example, cars replaced horses, but it took decades. Somebody came up with the idea of a car. It had to be produced physically. It had to be sold. That generated itself a lot of jobs. Then it took literally decades for cars to be pervasive around the world. And in the meantime, it generated a lot of jobs. The day that Google or somebody comes up with human-level translation, the next day, billions of people on Earth can have access to that. So we're talking about multiple orders of magnitude difference in the time constant of the dissemination of that. And the day after that, there will be no more jobs for human translators. So the time constants are really dramatically different in the software and hardware.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And some people argue that the measure of inequality is the level of innovation times the rate of diffusion, and it's basically a technical function. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I haven't moderated, so I'm just going to run this over. Last question.
I'm Miranda Mowbray. Thank you for your talk. It's great hearing it from this kind of perspective. I think we need to have broader discussions from a broader perspective than just the narrow technical one that I'm used to. I've worked in cybersecurity, machine learning for cybersecurity, and this is really picking up on Vince Cerf's point. I think a lot of the public, what they're worried about is autonomous machines going wrong, taking bad decisions for themselves that are anti-human. But machines already cheat us, steal from us, lie to us, exploit us, and they're doing it because they're programmed to do so by humans. If we go down the path of your daughter and give machines rights and responsibilities, then the human owners have an immediate get-out. I didn't do it, the computer did.
Yeah, I think the question, thank you, the issues of accountability and responsibility are really, really vital, and it's debatable whether we're harder on humans or harder on machines, but yeah, thank you. I do think that there's something about the way, watching the way not only young people, but also really much older people interact with machine learning interfaces. Humans are really good at, they're really good at getting played, but they're really good at playing them too. And it's not always just whether or not they can see how the thing works, whether or not they can see the inside of it. People are, it's almost as if they're able to see their way around things and do the equivalent of camouflage, do the equivalent of sort of tricking and lying, I guess you could say, but also playing with and augmenting and being creative with things. And I think it's to our peril if we underestimate the extent to which, there are many people for whom the activation barrier is really high. But once you give an older person email, for example, there's no stopping them. So, Facebook or whatever it is. So I do think that there are, pros and cons. Whether or not with the massive automation, though, can we make jobs fast enough? And how does that interact with whatever phase of fintech we're in and capitalism we're in? It's aside from archiving it, documenting it, and really being attentive to it, which is one of the things we're trying to do with our data archiving, and it sounds like the Stanford project is really doing as well, is paying attention to that, but they're really big questions. Thank you very much.